Good morning, everyone. This is Robert standing in for Mike, and this is your morning briefing for Thursday, 27 March 2025. Let's get started off with Inside the Beltway. First, the Washington, D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals ruled 2-1 to block the Trump administration from resuming deportations under the Alien Enemies Act. One of the judges, Karen Henderson, said that this act was not being used appropriately. And to me, this looks like the next step for the Trump administration is to appeal directly to the Supreme Court for some type of emergency stay against Judge James Boasberg's orders pausing this Alien Enemies Act invocation. Next, the House is scheduling a vote on nationwide injunctions, and this is the No Rogue Rulings Act of 2025. According to this bill, it's going to limit the authority of lower federal courts to issue these nationwide injunctions. And it would also require a randomly selected 3-judge panel to respond to lawsuits in multiple districts. And the idea is to prevent forum shopping, which is being used by a lot of the Trump resistance 2.0 lawsuits. They are looking for sympathetic judges. And finally, in our Inside the Beltway rollups, Rep. Thomas Massey from Kentucky has introduced the Dual Loyalty Disclosure Act. And this would require candidates for federal offices to disclose both that they possess dual citizenship and which country they have that other citizenship in. And Massey said when he introduced this bill that at a minimum, federal lawmakers should disclose citizenship in foreign countries and abstain from votes benefiting from those countries. I am on the fence right now about whether this will pass in the House. I think there's a lot of sentiment both in the Republican Party and the Democratic Party in Congress to address foreign interference in U.S. elections, but I am not sure that they are willing to pass this bill. So I don't expect that it will get through the House, at least in this current congressional session. And finally, moving on to our Inside the Beltway warning item, Senator Elizabeth Warren, during an interview yesterday, she said she's worried the Trump administration believes there are no constitutional constraints on presidential power. And she said to her that, quote, smells like a constitutional crisis. She also said the Democrats are still looking for what she called a triggering point to fight the Trump administration, while congressional Democrats are, quote, locked arms and moving in the same direction. I think this is some interesting messaging going on, because in this interview, she said she previously thought of a constitutional crisis as a light switch, that you're either in one or not in one. And I think now arguing that Trump trying to reassert Article 2 powers, which is what the Trump administration has said explicitly, is itself a constitutional crisis, I think is a change in the messaging strategy from the Democratic Party. I'm also skeptical that Democratic lawmakers are completely unified. The House seems to be much more upset with Chuck Schumer over what they said he was capitulating to Trump during the government shutdown fight. And I think in the fight over the direction of the party, there are some younger Senate Democrats that seem to be trying to moderate more than House Democrats. And I think this is due to the dynamic of statewide versus district elections. And in the House, I think we'll see a bigger push toward more progressive messaging, or maintaining the progressive messaging the Democrats had in 2024. Which, speaking of 2024, there was a recent interview with a Democrat-aligned firm called Blue Rose Research, and they said they aggregated all the data, the voter data from 2024, and they said that the election data points toward actually a conservative shift in what they call the politically disengaged electorate, and that is voters who describe themselves as not paying attention to the news, and that Democrats actually may not benefit from higher turnout in elections. And then there was also a major conservative shift among younger voters in 2024. So I think the Democrats are really going two ways. There are Democrats who have an incentive to moderate. They're looking at this polling data after 2024, seeing that voters are trending more conservative, or even Democrat-based voters don't like the direction the Democratic Party's headed as they become more liberal, and they're going to try to pull the Democratic Party on the national level into a more moderate position, while some of the House Democrats, the more progressive parts of the Democratic Party, are going to try to pull it more liberal. And interestingly, Ezra Klein, he recently put out a book called Abundance, and there's this attempt to, I think, create a third, more moderate position for Democrats in this abundance messaging. But he pointed out that the 2030 census could see Democratic states actually lose at least 12 House seats and electoral votes. And if this is true, I think the Democrats are on basically a shot clock to turn the political tide in the next two election cycles, which I think explains why there is sentiment in the Democratic Senate to try to moderate ahead of that. Moving on to our roll-ups, the CBO released its forecast yesterday for the X date, and that's the date that the U.S. government will breach the debt ceiling. They warned that the debt ceiling will be breached by August if Congress does not raise the debt limit. And in this announcement, they also said that the debt ceiling could be breached as soon as late May if government borrowing is higher than they project. And this is before additional tax revenues are expected in the summer. The House reconciliation bill we've covered a few times. It does include a debt ceiling increase of $4 trillion, but right now there's disagreement in the Senate over raising the debt limit with this bill. And it would only require a simple majority in the Senate, but there's also a fight over what's called the current policy baseline scoring data or scoring method. And basically, this is what Ray Dalio warned yesterday to House and Senate Republicans, what he called unfunded tax cuts. And I think what they're trying to do is use that to get this bill passed before this potential late May debt ceiling breach. But as Ray Dalio said, this does put the U.S. in a precarious position because it is going to, or would increase deficit spending in U.S. debt. Moving on to the domestic roll-ups. The Kansas State Legislature, they passed Senate Bill 4, and this sets a deadline for counting mail-in ballots to 7 p.m. on Election Day. And this was actually overriding Kansas Governor Laura Kelly's veto Monday. Previously, Kansas law allowed mail-in ballots to be counted for more than a week if they were postmarked by Election Day. This is one direction I think we'll start to see states going after Trump's executive order we covered yesterday on securing elections. I think this is probably where red states and possibly even states that have mixed governments with enough of a Republican legislative majority will go ahead of the 2026 midterms. Oklo CEO Jacob DeWitt, he said the Trump administration is going to be positive for the nuclear industry. He expects the Trump administration to remove red tape on nuclear development. He also said Oklo is planning to deploy its first small modular nuclear reactor in 2027. Looking at the timeline that Oklo put out, they did get a test permit for their initial prototype reactor in 2019. So I think they're talking about actually deploying a commercial small modular reactor. And Jared and I were actually talking about this before the show, and I think you pointed out that this puts the U.S. actually ahead of all the other proposed SMR projects.
Not quite entirely ahead. China does have a couple of them that are commercial. However, we were talking about a Japanese-American one that is being installed in Canada. I believe it's up in Ottawa. But it's up in Canada. It's supposed to go online in 2028. And considering that this one is coming online in 2027 and is likely going to be commercial as well, what that tells me is our small modular reactor technology is a lot more mature than what is normally said. And to go along with that, if China's already pushing out, small modular reactors, and they're really just getting started on it, I think we likely saw a bit of intellectual property theft across international borders there again, because that tends to be how it works with the Chinese. Is they come in, find a very cutting edge technology, take what they can, and then try to implement it as quick as possible. And they have been implementing it. But what that would mean for us is that our technology is probably a lot more mature than what we've been led to believe, which means quicker timelines as long as you can get through the red tape.
Well, I think DeWitt's right here. There's been a lot of noise coming out of the Trump administration, especially Energy Secretary Chris Wright. They publicly backed lowering barriers of entry on the regulatory side for energy development. And I think they are, big supporters of the small modular reactor technology. So I do expect to see the Trump administration start trying to cut some of this red tape, especially on permits for like their proposed 2027 deployment.
Yeah. And with removing red tape and allowing, broader experimentation with nuclear reactors, we could see a return to much more nuclear powered navy, and this does actually help the space development, which we're about to get into here with the spy satellites. But it having a truly small reactor to power vessels would significantly enhance the power output of basically every single vessel.
Thank you for that, Jared. We're going to move on to the last domestic roll-up. And this is according to people familiar with the matter. The Trump administration directed the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency and the National Reconnaissance Office to conduct satellite surveillance on the U.S.-Mexico border. The NGA did say they created a task force to, quote, support the U.S. border mission. And so it looks like we're seeing a lot more deployments of these higher level resources. I think there's a second Arleigh Burke class ship supposed to be deployed to the border as well, or to monitor the waters around the U.S.-Mexico border. I think both in the in the Pacific, and there's one also in the Gulf. And then Jared, if you could come back on to take us through your roll-up items, please.
Absolutely. So the Canadians announced yesterday a $1.4 billion US automotive sector investment plan. And the Prime Minister intends to make all vehicle parts entirely in Canada so that they have an insular market, similar to how the Trump administration intends to do here. But that would mean no U.S. input and avoiding any kind of tariff fallout on Canadians. Now, I think this is the first step towards truly decoupling Canada's automotive industry from the United States. In the short term, that means less demand, but at the same time, the Trump administration is trying to create additional demand for the American automotive sector in America, so that may be mitigated there. But in the long term, Canada does currently rely on the American automotive industry basically as a whole. That could actually severely hinder any kind of long-term American growth. Over in Israel, there's some interesting talk coming out of both sides of the government there. The opposition leader warned last week that the Netanyahu is, quote, doing everything it can to ignite a civil war. And yesterday, during a radio interview, one of Prime Minister Netanyahu's party members said that Israel needed a civil war in order to drive out opposition parties because they, quote, don't accept the legitimacy of the Likud government. And Likud's the current ruling party. Now, I don't think they're going to go into a civil war. That's strategically disadvantageous when you're already in the middle of a war. But the rhetoric is concerning for stability nonetheless.
Yeah, I think I think you said that member of parliament under the Likud said that they're already in a civil war. I think that was pretty clear that there's some kind of political warfare going on here, because if I remember right, the judicial reforms that Netanyahu was trying to implement, there were like massive protests, and if I remember correctly, weren't some of the Israeli intelligence services involved with those protests?
I don't remember.
So yeah, to me, this seems like they are in a precarious position as far as government legitimacy goes, and probably not that much different than we are right now, where there's a huge political fight going on over constitutional authority and separation of powers.
Yep. All right. Moving deeper into Asia, South Korea and China are having an interesting dispute. We don't normally cover that one very much. So China is building structures in the Yellow Sea where their exclusive economic zone overlaps with South Korea's exclusive economic zone. And these structures are not well defined. They are made of steel, so they intend to be permanent. They're built into the seabed, but their actual mission is not well defined. And they did not permit Korea to investigate what was happening, despite the fact that this is a shared economic zone. So, in response, Korea is building semi-permanent environmental structures to investigate, regardless of Chinese cooperation. Now, these are all reportedly near the Socotra Rock, which would actually give China a strategic outpost to observe Korean and Japanese forces in the event of a Taiwan contingency. So I think that's what's actually happening here, despite anything China could say. It we know most of their technology is dual use. They have reporting procedures for basically everything, and they have embedded party members in every aspect of their society. So I think what's going to happen here is that they will use these structures for basically an early warning system to watch out for any kind of Japanese or Korean force that could assist in Taiwan. Now, speaking of Taiwan, Taiwan's agriculture minister told his legislature yesterday that Taiwan's state-run food reserves would normally last 8 to 12 months when questioned about it. So there's they could survive up to 12 months with no additional food input. He also said that there are 5.5 months worth of grain alone still in store, and that none of these calculations included the private sector reserves. So there are actually private sectors trying to build up basically they're trying to conduct preparedness for these contingencies. So what that means in total is that basically Taiwan is going to last at least a year, and all of this is without the idea that there would be an anti-China coalition running the blockade to provide them additional resources, which I think almost certainly would happen. Now, Taiwan's main limiting factor for resisting a Chinese remains energy. And I think energy would likely be rationed, mainly because this would be existential for Taiwan. So, all aspects of their society would be dedicated toward fighting off the Chinese in this. Now, this extends the operational burden on China significantly and would result, I think, in the anti-China coalition successfully running the blockade in order to extend Taiwan's resistance. Because now, China currently, I've never seen them run a true year-long presence around anything except the Senkaku Islands down in southwestern Japan. But they were constantly having to send out new ships to replace the ones currently running it. So I think the blockade would actually be considerably weakened in the event that it did last this long.
Thank you for that, Jared. Let's move on to our warning items for today. And the first is a Delaware bill that is overhauling some of the legal restrictions on corporations. And this is, I think, in response to the Dexit or the Delaware exit, which we've reported on over the last couple of months, are corporations moving their headquarters out of Delaware to other states after the Chancellery Courts basically clawed back. I think it was a $55 billion compensation package from Elon Musk. So Delaware Governor Matt Meyer, he signed this. It's called Senate Bill 21 into law yesterday. And this is going to lower the legal guardrails on insider deals and restrict shareholder access to corporate board members' communications. And a lot of the critics of the bill have said this is actually an overreaction to Dexit or these corporations planning to leave Delaware. And supporters have said an important point, I think, that there are legitimate concerns with a legal swing empowering minority investors that they say have made even routine transactions unpredictable. And I think this point about minority investors having outsized power applies nationally, not just in Delaware, because this is or was the mechanism that fund managers like BlackRock and Vanguard and State Street used to successfully push things like ESG. Because these minority investors, they can have outsized power over corporate boards and executives because they're more organized in their votes or proxy votes where they basically vote for the shareholders, the actual shareholders who are like the state pension funds, whose funds they manage, than the other, majority of shareholders who are much more disorganized. And in the BlackRock case, they may have also been breaking the law, including skirting some SEC filing requirements that were not enforced during the Biden administration. And on that front, the Trump administration did tighten up those filing requirements for, shareholders above 5%. Basically, when a company or a fund manager buys 5% or more of the shares of a company, they have to report to the SEC. And apparently some of these organized minority shareholders under either fund managers or Some of the other groups that have bought a significant single or double percentage of shares in a company in order to affect the politics of that company, they were not filing with the SEC for that. So I think this is possibly setting a precedent for a push back against this minority investor activism in the United States, which is we've seen a little bit of pushback on ESG, but I think it's still like a lot of other initiatives the Trump administration has tried to fight against with political influence over private industry. There's still a lot of these funds effectively doing the same thing, even though they've left a lot of the organizations they pushed ESG and net zero under. And Jared, if you can come on and take us through your warning item, which is talking about an orbital carrier for the U.S. Space Force.
Yeah, we get to talk about the cool stuff. The U.S. Space Force contracted Gravitics to build an orbital carrier for $60 million, which is notably low. The carrier is supposed to carry multiple maneuverable satellites to rapidly respond to spaceborne threats, which is something that's been talked about for quite a few years. Basically, how do you conduct maneuver warfare in space? And that means something a little bit different up there. It's how do you actually conduct the maneuvers? Because normally you're just running off of inertia. Now, after a few years, here we go. It's happening. The proposed project also appears to build off of an existing space station module technology that Gravitics was contracted to develop last year. So when you combine the low price tag and the existing technology, this looks like it could be rapidly developed and deployed, which overall allows the U.S. to maintain its significant advantage in space warfare over China and Russia.
All right, thank you for that, Jared. Let's go to some questions and answers since we have some time this morning. And the first one from Griseo Nemo, is there a possibility the Democratic Party could split? I don't think so. I think there's a lot of talk, especially from progressives, about how the two-party system, we need to get rid of it. We need to go to something like the Westminster-style system for U.S. government because they allow multiple parties. Well, I think the truth of the matter is that's just the kind of the natural way politics ends up. So in the U.S., for the parties are really kind of pre-election coalitions, which is why you can have a Democratic Party that has progressives, left-wing, more radical left-wing candidates, that run in the House, and blue dog Democrats, and in the Republican Party you can have the more MAGA populist candidates plus the Main Street Caucus or the House Freedom Caucus type candidates, because these are basically pre-election coalitions. And if the Democratic Party were to split, I think it'd be very, very quickly coalesce back into a single party, which is why I think what's really going on here is just a fight over who can control the infrastructure of the Democratic Party and take it in the direction they want, rather than trying to split off. Some of the more, as Mike and I have pointed out, some of the more left wing and progressive parts of the party and voters have said that they're going to go away. Like there's no more left liberal coalition. But I think there's still a push within the party from progressives to try to get more influence in party leadership. And then the next question, what kind from Carol W7WXV, what kind of reactors are these small modular reactors? As far as I understand, these are nuclear fission reactors.
She's probably talking about the fuel types, which the most common types are uranium and thorium.
Okay. Right. And then Ben T, the U.S. has sent 2 destroyers to the southern border, wondering if you could detail the range of activities in which they will be engaged.
No, no. So mostly it's going to be monitoring. The modern Navy ships are incredible. They have incredible sensor suites. So it's probably more supporting like what the P8 is doing up there, where it's finding people.
That would make sense, especially considering the NGA and NRO basically confirmed that they are conducting satellite, or they're planning to conduct satellite surveillance on the border. It seems like the Trump administration is really trying to get as many sensors down there as possible, or as reasonable.
So every surface combatant also has a VBSS team. So technically, they could do like boarding operations as well if they find somebody traveling out with dinghies full of people or drugs. They can do interdiction just fine like that. And if I remember right, there is a Coast Guard contingent under the Gravely, like subordinate to the Gravely, so that they would also conduct those same operations.
All right. I did see a question from Bad Web. Could you extrapolate the issues we might be dealing with regarding the 4 service members being found dead in Lithuania?
Yeah. It appears so. Right now, what it looks like is that they drove off during an exercise, sank their armored vehicle into a swamp, and did not make it. There was a lot of concern for a bit because that was near the border of Belarus, and they were just reported dead. And for a little bit, there were some local outlets reporting that they had been killed, but the official story right now is that they died by drowning.
Yeah, I think that's actually not. It's not. Well, I don't want to say it's common, but it's not unprecedented. I mean, there's been plenty of times in training exercises where vehicle drivers, especially at nighttime, get lost and drive into a ditch full of water. Or I mean, it's even happened in Iraq where guys drove for either because they were responding to contact, or they were lost at night, drove into a ditch and drowned because they couldn't get out of their vehicle. Yeah. So it's not unprecedented that this is just an accident.
Yeah, we had something similar happen on my deployment where two F-18s were practicing dogfighting because we were just out in the middle of nowhere, clipped each other, and we only recovered one. Like, you got to remember, the military does dangerous things, and sometimes people die even in training.
All right, and then also from Bad Wabbit, I did see this comment. Where did I put it? Oh, I still do not see how that was legal. I think this is in reference to the ESG and the Delaware basically reform of their corporate law. Well, a lot of the things BlackRock did were not necessarily legal. From what I understand, they were threatening corporate compensation packages, and they do these corporate engagement retreats that are, from the way I've heard it characterized, are basically shakedowns where they direct these C-suite executives on where they want them to take the company. And that's because they have this outsized power as minority shareholders, or at least proxies for the minority shareholders, because the money that fund managers like BlackRock and Vanguard and State Street manage is not actually their money. So like Larry Fink does not actually have I think it was last I saw $1.3 trillion in a bank account somewhere. These are all funds that he's managing on behalf of someone else. So they use these proxy votes to flex their outsized power as a 5 or 10% shareholder, to threaten to vote down compensation packages, and put out messaging for these C-suite executives on where they want their companies to go. And then, like I said, with this SEC thing that I heard recently, the SEC under the Biden administration was actually not enforcing those filing requirements when they were purchasing 5% or more of the shares of a company in order to push ESG. And then the next question from Ballistic Squeeze: do you think the space carrier will violate the non-militarized agreement?
Yes, but I'm not entirely sure how much weight that agreement even has at this point. Russia and the United States have been talking about weaponizing space for basically the entirety of the space race, even once they signed that agreement. I mean, for goodness sake, the whole was it the Star Wars program under Reagan was saying we're weaponizing space at the same time that we had just recently signed the agreement saying we will not weaponize space. And space is understood as a warfare domain anyway. And on top of that, the two peoples that would actually enforce that, Russia and the United States, are the ones most likely to break the treaty, and also talking about breaking the treaty. So the entire enforcement mechanism is kind of void.
All right. Well, if that'll do it for questions today, That's the end of the show. We'll be back with you at 08 Central tomorrow. Be safe and stay out front.